Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Cuddy from the Chicago Humanities Festival, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, John Dickerson in conversation with Charles Whitaker on the American presidency and presidential power. This program is part of our summer series, which is running through mid-July. We hope you'll come back for more programs. A couple heads up, this coming Thursday, the wonderful Chicago comedian and actor Abby McEnany will be in conversation with the equally wonderful writer Samantha Irby, talking about Abby's Showtime series, Work in Progress. That's our Pride program, so we hope you will join us at 7 p.m. this Thursday. Then next Tuesday, a conversation between Arshay Cooper and Ron Stallworth. Arshay's memoir, A Most Beautiful Thing, was just reissued. It tells an amazing Chicago story about the first all-Black high school crew team and how that came together. There's a new documentary about that experience. So they'll be talking about the memoir and the documentary and how Arshay's working to bring equity into the world of rowing and crew. So check out all the details about those events upcoming at chicagohumanities.org. We also have a program with Charles Kaufman in early July, Charlie Kaufman, that is. And while you're there, you can watch more programs. You can make a donation, become a member. If you haven't, renew your membership. It is definitely the support of members and donors that keeps this kind of programming going. So we appreciate so much your support. To that end, I want to thank Fifth Third Bank. The event tonight wouldn't be happening without their generous support. Thank you so much. I also want to thank our captioner, Joe Gale, who will be doing live captioning throughout tonight's program. If you want to access that, just click on the little square with the CC in it on your screen, and that will make the captions pop up. I want to thank our partner bookseller, Seminary Co-op. They're an independent nonprofit bookstore on Chicago's South Side. Support them and support John Dickerson by buying a copy of his book. Many of you already have. We encourage you to go to Seminary to make that purchase after you've seen the program. Of course, I want to thank my colleagues at CHF for working to put together this program tonight, and thank all of you for showing up. I think the thing that brings us together is our shared love of the humanities and the understanding that to understand where we are in this moment and where we are or should be headed, the place to start answering those questions is with the humanities, and that's what we try to do with our programming. So thank you for supporting that mission. Now, get your questions ready. We'll be taking your questions during the program, and you can share those in the YouTube chat channel. And now let's get ready to welcome our presenters tonight. John Dickerson is the author of The Hardest Job in the World. He is also a correspondent for 60 Minutes, and you may know him from CBS This Morning and Face the Nation, and as the co-host of the Slate podcast, Political Gabfest, formerly. Charles Whitaker is Dean and Professor of Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, Media, and Integrated Marketing Communications. Previously, he was senior editor at Ebony magazine, and he is the co-curator of the Ida B. Wells Award, which is presented by Medill in partnership with the National Association of Black Journalists. Between them, they know an enormous amount about the presidency, about covering presidents, presidential politics. So please join me in giving them a very warm welcome, Charles Whitaker and John Dickerson.
Thank you so much, Allison. I thought I knew a lot about the presidency, but John actually learned a lot reading this book. It was quite fascinating. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for writing such an interesting book. I wanted to know what prompted you to write it, particularly at this moment in time. You mentioned early on that in the past 40 years, there have actually been 3 books about how the presidency has expanded, one by Arthur Schlesinger, The Imperial Presidency, and oddly, 2 books with the same title, The Impossible Presidency. So what made you want to weigh into this territory and sort of examine the presidency at this moment in time?
Well, first of all, thank you, Charles, for joining me tonight. I'm really looking forward to this. You're right. It's been examined to death, the overloaded nature of the presidential to-do list. And you mentioned there are 2 books with the title Impossible Presidency. There was a Newsweek cover story on the Obama administration called The Impossible Presidency. And a year or 2 years ago, I wrote a cover story for The Atlantic called, you guessed it, The Impossible Presidency. This is a combination of two forces. One is the larger force, which is that in covering presidencies and campaigns for the last 30 years, increasingly I saw a disconnect from the way we talk about the way we talk about the presidency in campaigns, and then the thing I would go cover after the campaigns are over. In the campaigns, we talk about one sort of superhero president who can change things with the force of their will, and then they get into office, and it's a lot more complicated than that. And that disconnect is something that is where a lot of the frustration that all those voters I've talked to over the years, that's where a lot of that frustration is housed. And then the second part of this book came to me in 2004, standing in George W. Bush's driveway after I just interviewed him with my colleague at Time magazine, Nancy Gibbs. And President Bush said, if you want to ask somebody whether they can do the job of being the president, ask them how they make decisions. And what that triggered for me was a way of thinking about the job itself. What are the requirements for the job? George Bush says it's about making decisions. Okay, what does that mean? And shouldn't we look for those attributes in the person when we're having our campaigns to pick them for the job in which they're going to start doing things? So I've been kind of mulling over these ideas for years, and then finally decided to put them all down between two covers.
So as you started looking at it, what is it that makes the job of the presidency so impossible? What is it that has made it this, voluminous thing that has, expanded our imagination, exceeded our imaginations?
I think it's a couple of things. One is that the to-do list has just grown. So Jim Jones, who was the national security advisor for President Obama, said, before I would meet and brief the president every day, I would write a list of the 10 national security challenges to America. He said today I could do that and I'd come up with 20. And that's just in national security. Then on the economic front, the speed of transactions and the interconnectedness of the globe mean that presidents are now engaged in emergency repair when it comes to the economy. We've seen it with respect to the pandemic. We've seen it with respect to the Great Recession in 2007 to 2009. So the president now not only has to try to do what the president can to affect economic policy as it moves slowly across the business cycle, but there are now instances in which the president and his or her team has to be the emergency firefighters. Those are just two areas. We can go through the rest of the long list of things that have happened to a president. But then, while the to-do list has gotten longer, the ability to manage that to-do list has gotten harder. Two things. One, Congress, which used to be a partner, is less of a partner now, which means puts more on the presidential to-do list. And then finally is our expectations of the office, which are set during campaigns and then exacerbated by the way we think about the presidency, make it very hard for a president to meet those expectations. So the environment in that way has gotten harder too.
I want to drill into a lot of those things, but first I want to, just as a comparison, a lot of people in high-powered jobs at the top of an organizational pyramid have these complex things that they are juggling. You talked to Tim Cook just recently, and he says he thinks of himself as a conductor. You say in the book, he thinks of himself as a conductor guiding a talented operation of colleagues. I think about, in my own world, a university president is the head of a hospital and a law school and has multiple clinics and all these people from all these disciplines. And the expectation is that isn't that he or she knows all of those things, but that they have a team of people who will advise them and they will ultimately make decisions. Isn't that what the presidency is? What's different about it?
Right. Well, first of all, it's such a joy talking to somebody who's read the books because I'm thrilled, So you've put your finger on two important things. The Tim Cook conversation I had with him, I interviewed Tim Cook and a number of other CEOs about, well, what's your job like? You're in a huge organization. There's no way, Tim Cook can be up to his elbows in all the different things that Apple is involved in. And he said, as you said, he's a conductor, which means he's got somebody in first violin. It means he's got somebody who can play the heck out of the glockenspiel, if there's even a glockenspiel in an orchestra. And he tries to do what he can to make everybody play in concert together. But then he also talked about himself as being somebody who tries to take the noise away, which is to say, get rid of the distractions. So, we'll get back to team building in a second, but a president they've tried to do this. It's called cabinet government.
Right.
And this became a very fashionable thing in the Carter era because after Nixon, everybody thought, oh, you can't have all of this power in one person. So Carter tried to farm it out to his cabinet agencies. Totally the right thing to try to do, completely in keeping with the sort of wise thinking at the time. The problem is there's politics involved in a presidency that Tim Cook doesn't really have to deal with. And so what happens in a presidency is if your Secretary of Energy goes off by him or herself and makes some boneheaded play, you get a share of the blame in a way that's much more damaging to you politically than happens with Tim Cook. And secondly, in Tim Cook's world or any business world, there are ways of coordinating across different agencies that they work on and adapt constantly. In the federal government, if you're in the Department of Energy and you are creating energy policy, you're also creating policy for lots of other departments. And those departments want to say, but there's no overriding structure to make sure everybody behaves and plays nicely. If you want that, then you got to run everything out of the White House, which then gets you back to your original problem, which is you're running everything out of the White House. So we talk about the White House sometimes as a business, but it shares none of the aspects of business. It's kind of got all of the duties and none of the benefits, or none of the tools, I should say, of the private sector that would make operating as a team and efficiently and adaptively possible in that job.
So we're not going to deal with 45 just yet. We'll get to this president, but in a functioning presidency, what would you suggest we should do to kind of make this role more manageable?
I think two things. There was one which individual presidents can do, and then there's some kind of change that has to happen. I don't know where it's going to come from, either through a commission that thinks about the presidency or through Congress rewiring the presidency. But what happens is a president comes in and the organization is both in place, which is to say the bureaucracy, which I don't use as a pejorative term, but a president has to come in and then kind of get up to speed with the way the business works. You would never have a corporate merger, or not. It would be unlikely to have a corporate merger where a person would come in who is completely unfamiliar with the way the place works, which is what happens with every president. If they were unfamiliar with the way the place works, they'd be given some kind of a grace period to kind of get up to speed while they learned, how marketing works with respect to production and sales and all of that. In the presidency, no way. You've got to be moving right away. And by the way, things are coming into your inbox that are terrifying and that are surprising. So you would have to find some way to make the transitions better and also to make the integration between the presidential team and the existing team more smooth. What a president can do is do what Mitt Romney did and Jimmy Carter did actually as well. Never got to see how it worked out with Romney. Jimmy Carter had a bit of a crack up, but what Carter did was before he was even the nominee, he put together a governing team and he told one of his allies, you put together a team that's going to run this White House because it's very complicated. You got to kind of learn it before we get there. The problem is his team was run by somebody who was not involved in the campaign, and all the people who were involved in the campaign said, wait a minute, we're not going to leave now that we've won. You've got to take us into the White House. Right. But the skill set for winning a campaign is not the skill set for governing in an office. Mitt Romney tried this with the Romney Readiness Project. When he was the nominee, he put together many hundreds of people that worked on what the Romney administration would look like well before the election night. And they were ready to go. Unfortunately, he didn't win, unfortunately for him. And they couldn't tell. And what's this all about? It's about building a team that can operate smoothly in this high pressure environment.
You say that, there is no apprenticeship and that's true. There is no apprenticeship for being president. One just is elected and goes into the job. Again, is this model the sort of Carter-Romney model, the model that you think would substitute for an apprenticeship?
I'd love to try it, which is to say, if you and I were holding a debate in the fall, it would be really wonderful if we could say to let's imagine we've got two challengers running. Say, okay, you've had your transition team up and running for 5 months now. Okay, so it would start earlier. Who are the top people you've picked and why? Or what have you learned about the way your White House is going to run in those 5 months? So in other words, we make the campaign questions about their preparation for the office. Have you been able to problem set, which is to say, what are your 3 big problems that you think you're going to face? And then what are you going to do about them? Who have you picked to be in charge of those people? And if you haven't picked somebody, why haven't you picked somebody to deal with your top 3 problems? And if you don't understand that really lots of your job is going to be other people handling these top 3 problems, because really what you're running for is not a single presidency, but you're running to be head of an organization. And if you haven't figured that out in the 5 months you've supposedly been working on it before you came to this debate, then we've learned something about your capacity to manage the job once you got in it. So what all of that is behind is this notion of trying to make a candidate's preparation for office something that they then are judged on in the campaign to see if they've got any of the attributes that would help run a good office.
So you skipped ahead a little bit to where I was going to go. That's okay. But in that assessment, I hear kind of an indictment of our business, in that we're the surrogates of the public. We're not asking the right questions of these candidates to get at whether they're fit for this office. Yes, is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, and it's an indictment that I would level at myself, having done this for nearly 30 years. And also, it's not easy. So because to ask a set of questions about management techniques, it's people aren't really ready for that in terms of what they've been conditioned for. So you have to kind of slow the whole thing down and say, the reason I'm asking these questions are because it's for this reason. And by that point, everybody's gone to take a nap. And so there's always been this tension that so well between having a lively exchange of views and a lively interaction with the candidates, and what the actual set of questions are that you would actually want to ask candidates. And then finally, no candidates are going to answer these questions because it creates huge vulnerabilities. Yeah. I mean, I hold hope in my heart that they would someday be forced to answer these kinds of questions because I think they're revealing. But it's going to take a few laps around the mulberry bush, chasing them to get them even to come close to answering these kinds of questions, because they're not the kinds of questions for which you can have prepackaged answers. And as you know,
if we get them accustomed, I mean, if we start asking them enough, then they will prepare and we'll have a better sense of that, right?
I agree. I think you're exactly right. In fact, I've suggested, or I think it would be interesting to say, we're going to have a debate on paper. You're going to be able to take as long as you want to answer these questions, and you can have an open book. And then we'll take a look and evaluate what you've written. That would require just what you said, which is the buy-in of both the journalism profession and the public to say they were given all this time to talk about what they think about management and who they would hire and all these, and their answers were really kind of lame. So it wasn't because they were surprised, it's because they haven't thought this through, and then to penalize them for that. But that would require a world in which people weren't motivated so much by the partisanship that I write so much about in the book, and the way that structure gets in the way of trying to get at some of these bigger issues, or even just get at what their positions are on the issues.
You say that we're a president-obsessed nation. Why is that a bad thing?
This is a line from Sid Milkis at the University of Virginia, a political scientist. And I think it's bad in 2 ways. One, it represents the idea that basically we drive all public questions through the presidency, and that wasn't the way it should be designed. A, because it puts too much power in one person. B, because it lets Congress off the hook of all the work they're supposed to be doing. And Congress is the better institution for lots of public questions. It represents more diversity of views. It gives the minority a kind of say. If they lose in a debate, at least they've gone through a process where they feel like they've been heard, and maybe they can get a piece of whatever the final legislation is. But then also the celebrity nature of the presidency draws all our eyes to that, and then it becomes theater review about what the president is saying and what the president is doing, and my goodness, the size of the crowd size and all that foolishness. And there are, for real issues at this current moment, we're dealing with major issues, but there are always major issues. And, you know, part of our job is to pay attention to those major issues before they're on the front page, because maybe if we all paid attention to them before they hit the front page, they wouldn't make it a front page.
Let's go back then and trace how we got here. How did we become such a president-obsessed nation? The framers, you know, as you say, the American presidency was created at a moment of desperation and uncertainty about the new nation and its experimental democracy. How did they see this role?
One of the delights in this book was, you know, I basically tried to go to the original blueprint of the office and say, what were they trying to do here? You know, and we all know what the blueprint looks like now. It's no longer that one single room with a nice fireplace and a little bedroom off the living room, right? Now it's got, you know, all kinds of crazy parts of it that we don't even understand. There's a tower that's built in a totally different architecture than the main building. It's a mess. So I went back to the original building, and they were caught between two things. On the one hand, they did not like what they had seen in the individual states in terms of mob rule. Essentially, the mob was influencing lawmakers too much. So they were worried about the mob, but then they were worried about the thing they were going to create to act as a counterbalance against the mob, which was a king, an executive. An executive. They didn't want that executive to become a king. Right. So 10 years after revolting against a king, they were willingly choosing to put power in the hand of an ambitious man, which was crazy. They just fought a revolution against that. So they were, but they also knew that if they didn't do that, they'd have all these individual states doing whatever the devil they wanted to do with no coordination. That meant trade routes were kind of up to each individual state. The currency in each state was different. If you wanted to try to repel a foreign country, the army you put together you'd have to get each individual state to pay. You might not be able to get the soldiers to fight. It was a mess. So they had this balance, but in that balance, the president's role was quite limited, and they would have been terrified by the role that the president has today, because they believed in their bones that basically you needed an ambitious man, and it was all men then, of course. You needed an ambitious man for this role. But because of ambition, you could never give that person too much power, because it was as solid and true as gravity, that if you gave an ambitious person power, they would abuse it. I mean, you can't argue your way out of it. It's like gravity, it exists. And so
they did toy with the idea of giving the president extraordinary powers at some amazing time, some natural disaster. They thought that, you know, perhaps in those times, we may need to give the president additional powers or dictatorial powers.
Exactly right. Just like in Rome, basically you could, you know, things got bad enough, we'd all vote for a dictator. The Congress at the time would vote for a dictator. And they decided in the end two things. One, there were things where you needed energy in the executive, as they talked about it, and on a constant basis. That sometimes if you, and we certainly feel this today, if you voted for the dictator, by the time you were doing that, you might be well behind. It might be too late to respond to the thing you've created a dictator to address. And then the other thing is, once you make him a dictator, it might be hard to unmake a president a dictator. And they thought if they built a system where the interlocking desire for power of each of the branches kind of constantly ground against each other, it would keep it in a kind of equipoise that you wouldn't always have to be messing with. Whereas with a dictator, you'd have to be tweaking it all the time. And they worried about that.
I don't want to geek out too much, but I was really fascinated by the history in the book. It's an impressive bit of research. My social science colleagues might call this a mixed methodological approach, because there are interviews, there's archival work, and I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the crafting of it. I mean, how did you go about determining how much history, how much contemporary stuff you would put in? Yeah, what was your process here, if you will?
Well, I was on kind of two tracks. I mean, when I looked into history, I was basically using history as another source. Like I would go into history and interview history and see what history had to say, because I'm not a historian, nor am I a political scientist. So I would go interview political science professors and historians and seek the originating questions that led us to our current moment. And part of what the storytelling is about is to say, look at how far we've come. And you can say, look at how far we've come in a sentence, and people say, oh, we've come pretty far, and that's it. But if you tell the story of how people marched in the streets in Washington, D.C. when FDR just asked to be given just a few aides to help him carry out his job. The depth of the revolt against that and the way in which Congress had such power over the executive really brings home how far we've traveled. And then that opens up the door to, okay, why have things changed so much? Which then gets you to a conversation about the structure of politics. And the reason that's important is the structure of partisanship today is what drives a lot of our problems. And it gives you some sense when you go into that structure, as I did maybe a little too much, is it gives you a sense of how difficult some of these changes are going to be to make, because they are structurally, it's not just the whims of human opinion, there's a whole structure that creates the partisanship we have at the moment. So I tried to tell stories that were not just stories for the sake of stories, although there's one I put in and one I didn't put in. The one I put in is when Roosevelt gets shot, when he's running on the Bull Moose ticket, Teddy Roosevelt gets shot and continues his speech. I've just always thought that's it's such an amazing moment. And so I slipped that into the section on campaigns and how they've changed. And the one I didn't tell was when Hamilton, in the middle of the Constitutional Convention, a leak gets out from the secret proceedings that they're going to bring in a British king, and it gets in the newspapers, and they have to issue the only press release, I think the only press release they ever issued from the Constitutional Convention. And Hamilton was the sort of Sherlock Holmes who had to go figure out where this leak came from. That didn't make it in the book because it was too much of a, it was just for fun to tell that story, but I didn't put it in the end. But it was always to interrogate history for the purposes of giving us some view on where we are now. And then the regular interviewing I did for it was based on my career and both the office of the presidency, what's it really like, trying to really get a sense of what the job is like. And then the campaign, that's really the reason I got into politics, was to cover campaigns. So that was the dessert for me.
No, interesting. So, we're looking at history, not only has the role of the presidency changed in terms of the functioning of the democracy, but also the symbolic role has changed. You say the contemporary president has to be the consoler in chief as well. Weren't presidents always called upon to respond to national or natural disasters? Whether it's Pearl Harbor or the Hindenburg or the Challenger explosion, how is that different today?
Well, they were called on it, but not as frequently as they are today. And again, it's television. Television takes a hit in the book because it gets blamed for so many things that are making the presidency more difficult. But basically now when there's a big national moment, it is a national moment because of television. And because there's a national stage, we need a central actor on that stage. And that basically is what called the president into those moments of national agony. I mean, there was, after the shooting at the University of Texas in the tower, there was no presidential statement. LBJ was in Texas at the time. Yeah. He said nothing. When Ronald Reagan was president and there was a massacre at McDonald's, there's no record that he said anything, no papers in his official files that suggest there was any fibrillation in the White House. I mean, you can imagine what that would happen today in those instances. So, and then I spent a fair amount of time on disaster response, because I thought that was interesting, not just in terms of the consoler role, but also what's a president doing in those moments? And is it really useful? And where did that come from? Because there were periods where Dwight Eisenhower is off on vacation and there are hurricanes barreling down and he's off, watching the shadows lengthen and got his fishing rod out. So it's more frequent now. And I think we see in its absence from President Trump in response to the Black Lives Matter movement and the killing of George Floyd and all these other moments and the protests and his muted or lack of response, we feel that expectation that has grown in the office over time.
What do you think a president's role should be in these times? We're in this fraught moment now, the throes of a global pandemic, a long overdue reckoning about systemic racism, big divisive issues, right? should our expectation be that the president is weighing in and setting a national tone for these conversations?
I think, yes, for both the pandemic and the question of systemic racism, but in two different ways.
Yeah.
We'll do systemic racism first, and then we'll do the pandemic. It is a presidential obligation to repair what is the original sin of the country. And a president must have an agenda on this front. When I asked President Trump about this when he was President-elect Trump, he said, basically, I'm going to make the economy good for everybody, and so African Americans are going to support me. So, and then subsequent, when I was at Face the Nation, I would ask various Senator Tim Scott, Paul Ryan, what more does the president need to do? And he talked about, and they all said, at some point he will go and do an event or take a trip or do something that shows he is paying some attention to something more than just economics. That never happened. In this moment, I think it's obvious. Presidents have a budget of symbolism and concern and political capital that they can spend for national moments. And how they choose to spend that budget tells us something about their priorities. And the most symbolic moment so far of this is that when there were protests in front of the White House asking to be heard on the question of systemic racism in the wake of George Floyd's death, the president had the protesters, the peaceful protesters, swept aside so that he could then have the photo op to show and spend his budget on his law and order photo op. And this was real money he was using. I mean, he used the Bible. That's expensive. That's the family jewels. When you start playing footsie with people's religious beliefs, you're deciding, I'm going to use a lot of symbolism on this moment. And then he also was using the military, which then members of the military both spoke out, and General Milley said I shouldn't have been involved. That's also a really expensive part of his, the family jewels, is using the military in a potentially political way. He used all of that budget on the law and order account. He did very little on the other account. And the other account was Americans crying out to be heard. I mean, they weren't asking for a 10-point plan just to be heard. And he said some remarks in various speeches about how George Floyd's family would have justice. That was not sufficient to the moment. And we ask our presidents to represent all the people in a country based on equality to be sufficient to the moment. And he has not been so far.
So that gets us to the current occupant of the White House. You say many of the customs of the presidency were not bolted in place when Donald Trump took office. This is my favorite sentence in the book. When Donald Trump, you say many of the customs of the presidency were not bolted in place when Donald Trump took office, but held there through tradition, restraint, deference, shame, and custom. Donald Trump has loosened the bolts and dismantled much of the apparatus, flinging parts onto the White House lawn. You call him the chaos president and say that he governs exactly the way that he campaigned. Unpack all of that for me. How is he different, and how has he changed the nature of the presidency?
Well, in so many different ways. And in not every way in which he's challenged the office is bad, or if he may have challenged the office in the right way, and then his solution for it may not be one that everybody would agree is the best one. But I mean, both in terms of the public role of the consoler in chief, if we talk about the pandemic, which I didn't address, but which you asked about, when you look at the pandemic or the public health manuals, both at the federal government and the state government level, the first thing they stress is clean information. Even if you don't know what's going on, tell us you don't know what's going on. Amanda Ripley, who wrote a wonderful book about how people respond to disasters, and how systems respond to disasters, stresses, and all the people she talked to, the importance of truth and the importance of giving people information, even if it's information that's going to scare them. It gives them some sense of control, and you have to keep that going all the way along, because if people are unsure about what you're saying, when you ask them to move quickly, to go from no masks to masks, it's the difference between people living and dying. So they need to really be locked in with you about what you're saying. And the president, in his response, has constantly downplayed the pandemic, been more fulsome and supportive of the Chinese than people would otherwise have been about it in terms of whether the Chinese were being straight with US medical officials. So he has disrupted this central part of the job. He had, of course, had 3 or more years of work on disrupting the free flow of clean and true information before that. So he had a real deficit ahead of time. But because Americans rally around the commander-in-chief in these moments, there could have been a reset. But saying things that are true in office to the best of your ability is a norm that has been severely challenged. The conciliatory role, the deal-making role, the presidents before had strained at least for some kind of bipartisanship. Even if it was kind of a sham, they tried. And one of the things I try to work on in the book, and I don't come to a conclusion, but is there an obligation for the presidents to really try to build bipartisan agreements? And because things have gotten so partisan, you can make a case that a president is wasting their time. And we can talk about that later if you want. But so in the sense, if something doesn't fit the mold, we both are able to assess the thing that doesn't fit the mold and where it doesn't fit it. But then we also get to look at the empty spaces and decide, well, is that a useful thing in this mold or not? So Donald Trump has been both something to evaluate or a president to evaluate, but he also highlights a lot about the office. So then the final tiny point is, what has he brought to the office that is good for the office? One thing I would settle on is, when presidents come in, there is an institution, there's the military, the national security structure that believes that things should go a certain way. And they've written the policies for Afghanistan, and he should just kind of go along with them. And presidents come in and they try and change those, and they usually lose. Either reality hits them in the face, or there are just so many people, generals and national security officials, who tell them to do it a certain way. It's very hard to challenge that conventional wisdom. But if you don't challenge the conventional wisdom, what happens is you end up 18 years in Afghanistan, and then the Afghanistan papers were published by the Washington Post with the off-the-record, very candid assessments of the military officials involved in Afghanistan, who said that they basically repeatedly misled the country about the status of that war and how things were going. And those are real lives that were lost. So a president who comes in and is as confrontational as President Trump has been about Afghanistan is what everybody should want. Now, then you get to the solutions problem. Are his solutions sufficient to meet the problem? Does he have the follow through and the skill to get from yelling at the generals to putting them on a right path? And that's where there's some difficulty.
Let me take some of the questions that are coming through. Andrew asked, during your first 100 days, this is also impressions of the current president. During your first 100 days interview with Trump, what was going through your mind when he sat down at his desk and shuffled papers?
So this is referring to when I interviewed him in his first 100 days. We did a first session in the Roosevelt Room, and then a second part of it was in the Oval Office. And I had asked him about President Obama because there are only so many humans on the planet who've had that job, and so I wanted to find out about, had they talked, had he asked him questions. He had just ordered missiles into Syria, so that's a big deal part of the job. What does that weight feel like? And he basically said that he had written off President Obama because he had called him sick and bad, and so I pressed him on all of that, and he had ultimately ended the interview abruptly. What was going through my head? Well, I didn't quite know what to think. Getting basically thrown out of the Oval Office is not necessarily a career move I would offer everybody. I also grew up in a very contentious family and have worked really hard to not be a jerk when I'm following a line of questioning, because I can be, and people have told me that over time. And I thought what might have happened is that I kind of got into that rhythm, and was, our job is to ask the questions, but not, be a jerk about it. I mean, be firm and be tough, but you can do that without, anyway. So I thought I might have lapsed into that. So I was a little worried about that. And then I thought, where do I go? I mean, which door do I go? Like, how how does one show oneself out? And that all hit me all at once. So, and then I thought maybe they were going to cancel the rest of the day. And then CBS had scheduled to have CBS This Morning, which I was not on at the time, but originate from the East Room, the whole show. And so I was worried that I had just ruined had just caused that to be canceled, which would have been a very expensive proposition. So it was a very exciting, moment.
I imagine. Russ asks, in terms of being the consoler in chief, what do you think of the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln's sort of role in being a consoler in chief, and what's different from Lincoln being consoler during the post-Civil War as opposed to today?
Well, the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural address, I spent some time with the second inaugural address in the book because the war's still going on. There are Confederate assassins in town to kill the president. And he gives a speech of reconciliation. Now, he's not without strategy in the speech, but in our days of conflict today, to talk about binding up the wounds and everybody coming back together as a union is pretty amazing. And so he was extraordinary. And I think what you get from one of the things that I tried to examine in the book was, where does character come from, and what do we mean when we talk about presidential character? And one of the things that James Q. Wilson, the conservative political scientist, said is basically character is self-control and empathy. And empathy is basically, going back to the scene in Lafayette Square with President Trump, empathy is meaningfully understanding and recognizing the rights and beliefs and opinions of people who are not in your grouping. And as president of the whole country, not just president of your base, that's what you're called to do. That's what the job is to meaningfully take into account those other people, because you're the only one who represents everybody. That's the job. Like, you want another job, that's great, but that's the job. So Lincoln had a lot of that empathy, which smarter people than I have tied to his own personal suffering and depression, and people have made a similar case for FDR. So Lincoln's amazing. My claim in the book is that this consoler role just becomes much more frequent. So it becomes something you have to do after natural disasters, and it becomes something every president needs to do, not just something a president has to do, occasionally, or that might skip a few presidencies before you have to do it again.
Yeah. You note in the book, though, that the political parties have pushed us into these corners to maintain power. And so are we too balkanized for us ever to elect another president who sees their job as kind of uniting us? I mean, Donald Trump is playing simply to the base. Again, the parties are so at odds. Who will be the uniter?
Right.
Will we find a uniter? Well,
and what will the route there be? I mean,
yeah,
one of the ways could be through an emergency moment that we're in either of the three big emergencies we're facing, whether it's systemic racism or the pandemic or the economy, and somebody who can get into the middle of any one of those conversations, recognize the equities and the beliefs of all groups concerned, who has standing from their own personal, from their own life or their experience or whatever. It's not just someone with a hot take, and can meaningfully speak across all those groups. And that's the beginning, that's just the beginning. Now, and then of course there's, what do you do to actually affect change in all these areas? I think it's possible. I think there is a hunger, to the extent that President Trump has not tended to some of these parts of the job. I think that creates an appetite for some of that. And we've seen in history an appetite created from president to president, sort of an appetite's created for the qualities they don't have. So I think you could imagine it coming back. What is less easy to imagine is how the partisanship that has got Congress so locked up changes. And, that writing that section of the book was very helpful for me, because we all know about partisanship, but, in going through the different structural reasons that it's changed was just very helpful in kind of locking down my own thinking. And I won't go into all the reasons, but it explains how difficult it's going to be, and speech making won't do it. And I think it also gets at the idea that basically we want change. I mean, the American story is so fascinating. The only real change that's ever made is when people demand it, and the people who often do are highly unpopular. And a president doesn't want to deal with them at first, and then ultimately has to deal with them. And that dance, which is full of suffering and woe and rights denied and equality denied, and it breaks your heart, is our story. Yeah. And a president that rushes in too fast and doesn't take into account the fact that the whole country has to come along, and this is where I love Frederick Douglass's assessment of Abraham Lincoln, when he says, from the genuine abolitionist ground, he was cold, tardy, and dull. But from the grounds of being a leader who took into account his people as he had to as a leader, he was, swift and on the right side, which is, by the way, the beginning of David Blight's great book on Frederick Douglass, which everybody should go get and read that beginning. Yes. Because it's amazing.
It is.
Anyway, this is a bit of a rambling question, but so maybe I should just stop on Frederick Douglass, because it's such a great assessment of of how we think about presidents.
Yeah, well, no, I agree. It's an amazing book. I'm going to give Joey the last word. Actually, the time is up. I can't believe it. Where did it go? I've had a good time here, but I'm going to give Joey
long
the last
answers.
question. I'm going to give Joey the last question. She asks, because it deals with our business, what challenges do journalists face? As the presidency has grown, it's also been difficult for journalists to cover the presidency as well. We now, there used to be a presidential reporter. There are now multiple people covering the White House for newspapers and broadcasts. So what are the challenges, and how will we deal with those, or how should we deal with those in the future?
There are so many challenges and there is some amazing journalism going on. One of the things that Donald Trump has done is both challenge journalists and our right to be a part of the American system. And what that has in part done is create a lot of amazing journalism that's gone just around the White House. That's covered his relationship in his personal business and his job. That's covered all the different tentacles of, and I don't use that pejoratively, just every administration has tentacles, all the different tentacles of what his administration is doing. But some of the problems, in no particular order, is there's the economic challenge that we all face in our business, which is to keep people reading and watching what we do, which is in tension with some of the complexity of the stories that we cover. One tiny one is that, in television, you need pictures to explain what you're talking about. Some of these issues and things that we're covering don't have pictures. The truly talented among us know how to tell the story, and the pictures catch up. But that's a challenge, and it's hard to do every single night on multiple stories. This particular president challenges the very nature of truth, does so at such a rapid clip that it's hard to catch up with one while the next thing is tumbling out. We have trouble with keeping our own standards. The competition now is between organizations that have a gatekeeping structure where if you don't follow best practices, you will no longer have a job. But you're also in a way competing with somebody who can put whatever they want out into the world, and who will get more advertising dollars and more attention for doing so. So those are just some of the challenges. And time and attention is another huge challenge, because we're all distracted by the people who have been glued to our conversation all night long are vibrating with anxiousness about what email might be out there or tweet they might be looking at, which is just
the 24-hour news cycle has made it just impossible to stay on top of it and to be thorough. And the fact-checking apparatus is just incredible trying to stay on top of this, especially when you have a president who has a questionable relationship with the truth. So
right. Yeah. Exactly.
John, I have enjoyed it tremendously. I am so sorry if the time has gone way too fast and I could actually talk to you for another hour or so. The book was really engaging and I love talking to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Charles. And again, it's incredibly heartwarming that you paid so much attention to the work. You know what it's like. You spend a lot of time on your own putting these things together, and I'm very grateful for you reading it and taking it so seriously. So thank you.
Well, I enjoyed it. So it was not hard work at all. It's actually a very pleasurable read. So thank you.
Good. And thanks everybody out there.
And yes, thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. I'm sorry to get to everyone's questions. I was talking too much myself. I'm really sorry, but there were some good questions here. But thank you all for chiming in, and enjoy. Take care. And thanks to the Chicago Humanities Festival for inviting us and inviting me. And I'd love to come back again.
All right.